Before we begin, let me start by acknowledging that the lands on which we are hosting this meeting include the territories of many nations. Canada Health Infoway recognizes that the many injustices experienced by the Indigenous peoples of what we now call Canada are not solely in the past, and that this history continues to affect health and well-being. Canada Health Infoway also respects that Indigenous peoples' right of self-determination and self-governance are empowered and enabled by timely access to data, including health data. I invite all attendees to reflect on the territories you're calling in from as we commit ourselves to gaining knowledge and contributing to reconciliation. In that context, thank you, Jonathan, for joining me today to talk about the information gaps and information governance challenges impacting digital health in First Nations. In the interest of maximizing the time available for discussion, I'll be brief in my introduction and direct you to Dr. Dewar's biography available on the partnership site. Dr. Jonathan Dewar is a leading expert in Indigenous health policy and research, and currently the Chief Executive Officer of the First Nations Information Governance Center. Welcome, Jonathan.
Thank you.
So before we get into the heart of the discussion, the First Nations Information Governance Center is best known to me from your work with the OCAP principles, but FNIGC has and continues to make significant contributions that enable First Nations communities to grow knowledge in health and social determinants of health for the First Nations peoples. Can you tell us a bit more about the broader mandate of FNIGC?
Yeah, sure. And thank you for inviting me to speak on behalf of my colleagues and really a long history of people doing this work. I'm just the latest person sitting in this chair who might be speaking to you from these perspectives. You've seen me talk before, so you know I'll start with a couple of caveats. The first being that FNIGC is a national organization, and it's important to note that we are strictly apolitical and strictly technical, which is to say, we're not a rights and title holding organization. So we don't represent, I will not be speaking on behalf of First Nations directly. We have been mandated to do the specific work that I'm going to talk to you about. And so I can speak from those perspectives, certainly. But on all of these issues, of course, it's the First Nations leadership and the thought leadership from First Nations who need to speak directly and to ensure that grassroots perspectives and the formal perspectives of First Nations are represented. But nonetheless, I'll speak from the perspective of myself and my colleagues at FNIGC. And again, I'm acknowledging that the work that I'm going to talk about is, coming up on 25 years old. If you look at the Regional Health Survey and, of course, the OCAP principles. And so we really do stand on the shoulders of giants to do this work. And so it's a real privilege to be able to do this work. Personally, my First Nations roots are through my maternal grandmother, and specifically her family, which is from the Huron-Wendat community of Wendake in Quebec. And I was not raised in the community, so won't be speaking from that perspective personally. But professionally, I think we'll weave a number of things together here that I think will be of real interest to your audience. So in terms of your question, thanks for your patience on the caveats. In terms of your questions, the broader mandate of the First Nations Information Governance Center. Mandate's kind of a tricky language. I'll focus instead on vision, mission, and the core strategic objectives that have been set for us by our national board. So when I joined the organization 4 years ago, we really were in a position of transition. There was the possibility for the kind of growth that my colleagues, my predecessors, had been working towards for years. We were really on the cusp of that transition and being able to move into those ideas and ideally into the implementation of those ideas. So I work very closely with our national board, and that represents the 10 First Nations regions in a voting capacity and the Assembly of First Nations in a non-voting capacity. I work very closely with our national board to develop a new vision, and that vision is that every First Nation will achieve data sovereignty in alignment with its distinct worldview. And so you can see that we've focused our work very much and very precisely in the space of First Nations data sovereignty. And it's important to make that distinction because while there is the terminology of Indigenous data sovereignty, and that's actually quite useful when we talk about Indigenous data sovereignty or IDSOV, as you'll sometimes see it in print, in international contexts. In a Canadian context, I think it behooves us to move away from that Indigenous terminology and instead focus on the rights holders themselves. So you have First Nations, you have Inuit, and you have the Métis Nation. So I think it is really important to make that distinction in Canada. And then, importantly, First Nations, Inuit, and the Métis Nation have historically and contemporarily different relationships with the Crown, and so approach these issues of sovereignty quite differently. And so Inuit and the Métis Nation need to be able to speak to the work that they do. So that's our vision, that every First Nation will achieve data sovereignty in alignment with its distinct worldview, acknowledging the diversity across and within First Nations within these lands we now call Canada. As a national organization, it means those 10 regions and all the nations within those regions come together and negotiate how to work collectively on, the work that we are mandated to do. And because of that diversity, there's a need to land on, a set of principles or sets of principles for how we might do this work. The one that we're most famous for is the OCAP principles, that being an acronym that stands for ownership, control, access, and possession. And I think we'll talk a bit more of that in a moment, but that set of principles has been in place for, as I said, close to 25 years. And so that's an example of how diverse First Nations can come together and to do, in our case, work that is best done or necessarily done at a national level. And again, we are very much focused on that national work. Our regional partners come together to do this national work, but it is the regions that have responsibility for any regional level data. And then, of course, nations always, as sovereign nations, they have authority over their information at regional, sub-regional, nation, and community level. That's not something that FNIGC does, though we are here as a tool to assist First Nations in a wide variety of work. And that can be found, and again, if you go to our website, you'll be able to see this in greater detail. That can be found in the way we articulate our mission. And then what we have as a set of 4 core strategic objectives that guide our work and really articulate how FNIGC, this national organization, can be a tool for First Nations to assert First Nations data sovereignty, to practice First Nations information governance and information management, and of course, all the complexities within.
So last year, you released a First Nations data governance strategy document, and the subtitle really grabbed my attention because it relates to the key focus of this discussion too. It was strengthening First Nations institutions and community capacity. Can you share a bit about the direction of the strategy and how it's being implemented?
Yeah, of course. So when I was talking about FNIGC being on the cusp of a potential transition, this is what we're talking about. So for a number of years, First Nations leadership, supported by technical expertise, some of whom still are part of the FNIGC family at the board level, at the regional level, and within our office here in Ottawa and in Akwesasne, we have been supporting First Nations leadership in these conversations around what do we need to do to truly be able to live up to that vision that we now have as an organization. And so this idea of a strategy, all good leadership and the supports for leadership are engaged in strategy. And so the idea of a formal strategy for this work was, in many ways, sort of a fait accompli, right? It's what one can expect in this kind of work. Nonetheless, the technical thought leadership supporting First Nations leadership advanced many conversations regionally and nationally over a number of years, we'd probably say decades, really, to the point where our national leadership in 2016 put forward a resolution. So the National Chiefs of Assembly put forward a resolution that called for a number of actions, one of which was the delivery of a national strategy, another of which was the establishment of what we refer to as regional information governance centers. Now, I'm only picking up on those 2 elements of that National Chiefs of Assembly resolution because in 2018, that's what ended up in the federal budget 2018. So the federal government funded FNIGC, which of course means the network of partners, to develop a national strategy, a national data governance strategy. We renamed it the First Nations Data Governance Strategy, still national, of course, and funded us to coordinate the establishment of regional information governance centers. So what does the strategy say? Well, over 2 years, from 2018 to 2020, when we delivered the strategy as required under that funding agreement, we engaged via our regional partners with First Nations, the thought leaders, the formal leadership, technical expertise across the country. That included a national event that we held in Calgary. We brought together many ideas, brought them in front of our board numerous times, and eventually the team and I refined those ideas until we had a national data governance strategy. And so the strategy articulates a multi-phased approach to achieving data sovereignty via institution building. So the idea of First Nations building up First Nations-led institutions. And remember, I referred to the call for us to, and the funding for us to coordinate the establishment of regional information governance centers. Well, those are the institutions we're talking about. So a regional information governance center, or RIGC, as we often say within our network, can also be thought of as a statistical institution. But there's two components there. There is the need for First Nations within a region to establish the information governance system or regime that they need, and frankly, that they lack, right? So if you think about Canada, Canada's information regime at the national, at the provincial, territorial, at the municipal level, there is that information regime. And of course, it slots First Nations, Inuit, and the Métis Nation within as, yet others in a long list of constituents within the Canadian context. But as First Nations are sovereign nations, that's not enough for First Nations. It's not enough for Canada in its nation-to-nation relationship or nation-to-nation relationships with First Nations. So this strategy really is designed to allow us to advance the work, to see the establishment of that information governance regime within a region, and then support leadership in determining what kind of institution they would build up to do the work within such a regime, within such a landscape or environment. So really the strategy is proposing support so that we can ensure that there is dedicated capacity in each of our regions to support the nations within those regions to answer those two key questions. What will you do, or what do you need in terms of an information governance body or regime? And then what would you build if you had the ability to build up a statistical institution by First Nations, for First Nations? An institution that would not need to be decolonized in the future or indigenized in the future because it was purpose-built by First Nations. And so if we do that regionally, as we were called to do by our national leadership, and of course our regional leadership by extension, what we were called, if we do that, and we put the resources into regions so they can support leadership to resolve on those questions, and then we get to the institution building itself, which is a later phase we anticipate following this first phase we anticipate entering into shortly. And I'll loop back to that point in a second. What we would have then is we would really change the landscape regionally, and we would ensure that we have these First Nations institutions in regions that continue to be a network like we currently are in the narrower focused work that FNIGC does. But that network of regional institutions could take on yet more work at the national level and be that missing national First Nations information governance and statistical capacity. I'm just going to loop back to that part that I said a moment ago. So what does this mean? Well, in budget 2021, there was funding, significant funding, for a First Nations data governance strategy, for us to continue that work. That funding is meant to advance what we had proposed as phase one of the data governance strategy. So that is, as I said, ensuring that we can put resources into the regions that will, for the first time in history, be dedicated capacity to work on those questions, and ultimately the foundation, laying the foundation for institution building. So it really is monumental. We are more than just on the cusp of this. We're really moving from pre-implementation work into implementation work. So it's an exciting time. Of course, we need to be successful in the 3-4 years of this phase one so that we can move into a phase two and a phase three that would see the completion of this goal, these aspirations.
Throughout the pandemic, we've heard a really strong consensus around the need for more and better information. And I say information, not just data, to enable governments to manage the pandemic and the work that's underway, and work is underway, I should say, to build a pan-Canadian data strategy. You just talked about the First Nations data strategy and how data governance strategy, excuse me, and how that's being implemented. And obviously a strong link between the two pieces there. In other arenas, you've also spoken about the data gaps that hinder First Nations communities in their planning and management that would benefit First Nations peoples, and the criticality of that data in the context of the calls to action, the Truth and Reconciliation Committee. Has the pandemic influenced those data gaps?
Yeah, it has. I'm actually going to start with the first part of your question. Yeah. Say one of the, I like to think that it's a provocative thing to say, but I've heard so many people say it, I feel like I'm simply stealing their lines. But a number of people say, and of course we do as well, that if you're talking about health data, Canada built a broken system. I mean, I think many people acknowledge that, right? There are all kinds of issues within the federated family. You have the federal level, you have provinces and territories, you have those jurisdictional issues. And so it really is a broken system. And so if it doesn't work effectively for Canadians, the impact on First Nations, Inuit, and the Métis Nation, those populations which are historically underserved, exponentially more so than other populations in Canada. Obviously, that system can't continue. It's not going to benefit Canadians. It's not going to benefit Indigenous peoples in Canada. So there is a lot of work, and you alluded to the conversations that are happening around the need for a pan-Canadian health data strategy. I think that's really exciting. And what I've been able to say to those kinds of audiences is exactly this point that I've just underscored here, which is if Canada built a broken system, what is Canada doing to fix that system for the benefit of Canadians? And how is Canada looking to ensure that what they've done historically and what they continue to perpetuate through this system is not perpetuated in an ongoing fashion for First Nations, Inuit, and the Métis Nation? I often say, and half jokingly, I suppose, it's that Canada needs to get its house in order. First Nations can't fix what Canada needs to fix. Remember, First Nations are in nation-to-nation relationships with the Crown, right? So there is the need to look at these issues through that lens or those lenses. And so Canada needs to get its house in order. It needs to fix up what's not working within the federated system. And there are Canadian institutions that serve First Nations. And so when we talk about building up First Nations institutions, it doesn't necessarily mean that Canadian institutions need to be torn down. No, instead, what we need to do is build up. We've long acknowledged the need for First Nations to lead via self-determination. So build up these institutions. Again, as I said earlier, the idea that an institution that is purpose-built by First Nations, won't perpetuate the mistakes of the past, right? Certainly won't be limited in the ways that a mainstream organization or institution may be limited. So as we build up First Nations institutions, Canadian institutions don't become irrelevant. It absolutely means that Canadian institutions will have to pivot, and there will be big conversations to be had within the context of the nation-to-nation relationships. For example, what we do with certain types of legislation, particularly legislation that enables certain Canadian institutions. Those kinds of changes will need to be managed as well. But ultimately, you would have, you're adding to what can be a very strong environment with some obvious need for improvement. But you're adding to this environment with these First Nations institutions and giving First Nations, yet more tools within the toolbox. So First Nations will continue to wield Canadian institutions where appropriate, but they'll also be able to wield First Nations institutions to do this work. And this is to the benefit of both First Nations and Canada, right? To be the best partner to First Nations, Canada is already in support of these ideas. They are funding this implementation of phase 1 of the data governance strategy. So we need to move forward together and build up in this way so that we can ensure that we are putting in place what can benefit both parties in this nation-to-nation relationship. Now, the COVID question. So has COVID Has COVID impacted, the issue of data gaps that we saw outside of COVID? I mean, yes, absolutely. First Nations communities, First Nations, and the governments and First Nations governments, really are the most oversubscribed governments, I would argue, certainly in the country, in the world, because they are federal, they're provincial, territorial, they're regional, they're municipal, right? They do all of those things that other governments, more reasonably, we can say, have the space to do. So if First Nations governments are so heavily oversubscribed, then what does it mean when they're faced with challenge after challenge after challenge? And then when you bring forward a monumental challenge like the COVID pandemic, a global pandemic, of course it is going to make things even more challenging for First Nations governments. And then all of the organizations like an FNIGC or another organization that works with them. So it is absolutely a great challenge. We've certainly seen that the completeness, availability, and timeliness of COVID data, of health data in this time of COVID has been impacted. I'll give you one concrete example. Very close to the beginning of the pandemic, Indigenous Services Canada had approached FNIGC in our role as a national organization in support of First Nations to see if we might be the appropriate place to steward national level case data. And with the support of our national board and our regional partners, we said, yes, that is something that we can support. It's now 18 months later, and we're still finalizing the information sharing agreement. So this is what happens when you don't have that information governance regime in place that we talk about, right? So we will get there, but it shouldn't be taking this long. It's taking this long because of these barriers. Now, that's felt, I think, exponentially worse at the regional level and at the local level. There are some real strengths, though. Colleagues in Manitoba, colleagues in Ontario, and other jurisdictions have really done some incredible work with their provincial or territorial government. And I'd love to focus on them. I know we don't have time, but certainly members of the audience, if you're in those areas, there's a real richness there to learn from. I would encourage people to do that.
It is certainly, I think, a shared challenge, and you describe it. There's something unifying about that. The other thing I hear very consistently, along with it takes so long to get agreements in place, is a desire to build more knowledge, to learn from First Nations, Métis, Inuit data governance experts, and ensure there is that cross-pollination of knowledge and that collaboration. Most of the folks attending this session are very aware of the OCAP principles, and the establishment of OCAP was critical in increasing digital health practitioners' capability and capacity to understand and engage with data self-sovereignty concepts. You're talking about the strategy, recognizing, of course, the challenges of resourcing and the massive workload of First Nations governance that you just described. How do we as a broader digital health community, how do we contribute to building this information governance knowledge and expertise, both within and in alliance with First Nations communities?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'll start with with OCAP. So I said I would loop back to OCAP at some point, and I think here is the appropriate place to do that. So I'm glad to hear that you in your network feel that many people are familiar with OCAP. And I think that is true. Like I said, OCAP is nearly 25 years old. You can't have worked with First Nations, whether it's in research or health information. You can't have worked with First Nations without having heard of OCAP. But having heard of OCAP and being expert in OCAP, obviously there's a distinction to be made there. There's another distinction that I'd want to make in the furtherance of helping people understand the importance of not just knowing about OCAP, but knowing OCAP, and ideally, like I said, as an expert user of this tool. So OCAP exists as a set of principles, and we as FNIGC are the national stewards of the OCAP principles. And we work with them as a set of principles. Of course, they can't be made real in the sense of ownership, control, access, and possession can be implemented. But here's that distinction I was talking about. It is only rights and title holders who can define and implement ownership, control, access, and possession. And they do this via their own worldview, via their own governance approaches, via their own First Nations laws, as the case may be. And so it is rights and title holders, not a non-rights holding organization like FNIGC, that determines what it means to own, control, access, and possess their information. And once they assert ownership, control, access, and possession, they can, of course, make decisions as it suits them. They may choose to work with data custodians. They may choose to as the owners of information, having control over information, they may choose to appoint a steward of data. FNIGC is a steward of the national data that comes out of our national survey work, but we don't own it. We don't control it. We are simply the stewards of it, and in a very defined way. So I think that really is important. So what can people in your network do? Well, don't just know about OCAP. Become expert in OCAP. And there are a few places that you could start. There's obviously the Fundamentals of OCAP online course that we offer, and we actually have a new version of it coming out midway, I think, through in 2022. We'll have a new, somewhat updated version of that because, as I said, we started having these conversations nearly 25 years ago. And here's the thing about this data governance strategy and the institutions that we're building. Our regional institutions are meant to also have this education, training and capacity development capacity within those institutions. Now, we're a number of years away from realizing those institutions being built up from the ground in the regions, but our regional partners, as they currently exist, also are expert in and much closer to this distinction between principle and definition and implementation. And so there are all kinds of fantastic resources locally for people within your network, and of course, regionally or provincially, territorially as well. But a place to start is certainly the Fundamentals of OCAP online course. And I don't know if I got to the end of your question, and you can maybe remind me if I didn't.
No, I think you did. And exciting to hear a new version and more information coming soon. That's super exciting. Perhaps to take a slightly different tack and look a bit more into the future, because I'm conscious we are almost through our time today. Another really contemporary challenge being explored by many in the digital health field is the ethical and equitable application of AI technologies to improve health. And I read a recent study from U of T that highlighted a clear ethno-racial equity gap in currently available data sets. Yeah. The study was focused on the use of AI technology in diabetes management, and it highlighted the direct risk of improperly trained AI tools being applied in the care of First Nations, Métis, or Inuit peoples, and also the potential lost benefit. The authors called for decisive action to confront these inequities before they're coded into our systems and are perpetuating the biases that we aim to eliminate. Do you have a perspective on that?
I do. I'll just yet another caveat here. I'm not an expert in AI, and some of the things that I'll say about traditional knowledge or traditional values, these are things that have been taught to me by knowledge keepers, people who are much smarter than me. So I'm, as I said, standing on the shoulders of giants when I make some of the comments that I'll make. I'll first say this about AI. I have been trying to read as much as I can. My colleagues and I have been trying to read as much as I can about the potential for this tool for First Nations and these institutions we're building. Obviously, we want to be able to wield the best tools. Here's what we know about AI. AI is hungry for data, right? It needs reams and reams and reams of information. Well, if we are facing an information deficit as First Nations, what does that mean for us? I mean, you put bad data in, or you have a paucity of data. Like, what does that mean for our ability to even approach the perspective of using this kind of tool? Now, I've been identifying it as a tool, and I think that is really important. And I'll say this, and again, as a researcher, I was taught this by many people over the years, right? As a researcher working in these kinds of contexts, whether you're a First Nations person or an ally, you are meant to work within a system of accountability. I mean, many First Nations traditional knowledge holders will talk about the importance of accountability. We have a board elder on our board who's Algonquin, Claudette Commanda. She may talk about the 7 grandfather teachings. And so I often, when asked about AI, I often say, there's one element of those 7 grandfather teachings that I think is really, really important here, and that's love, right? So love is one of the 7 grandfather teachings, and love is something that humans can have the capacity to engage with. But can an AI engage with a value or a teaching like that? I think that's a really important question, because we, the humans, must work within these systems of accountability. We must be held accountable. And that means if we're wielding tools, we're not holding tools accountable. We're holding the human beings wielding those tools accountable. So can that be said of AI? Is it possible for AI to get in front of the human beings to the point where it needs to be held accountable by these kinds of values? And I wonder, maybe I'll never be smart enough to understand this, but I wonder if AI can work with those grandfather teachings, right? Humility, love, like wisdom. These are things that I do wonder about. So that's all I can really say about AI. I think it's going to be a valuable tool. There are a lot of questions that need to be asked and answered about AI. And then it's this perspective that traditional knowledge holders and others will have to bring to the conversation to ensure that we are talking about human beings wielding tools, and that the human beings ultimately can be held accountable to culture, to community, to values, to principles.
When I was preparing for this conversation, I was struck by the number of contexts in which future-facing technology problems can stand to learn and be guided by principles, Indigenous laws and frameworks that are already well inculcated in community values, like, for example, frameworks around community or collective privacy in the context of genetic work. And I know you've got some really deep knowledge in genetic privacy. So I'm regretting our time is short today, because I think there is so much more to be learned and applied from the knowledge you hold onto contemporary problems that we're facing, both as a First Nations, Indigenous and Métis communities, First Nations, Métis and Inuit communities, as well as the Canadian population at large beyond those. So I want to very much thank you, Jonathan, for engaging in this discussion and educating us on these critical topics. As we commit ourselves in the digital health community to contributing to reconciliation, thank you for helping us to understand the work that needs to happen to ensure that Indigenous Canadians benefit equally from improvements in digital health. Thank you very much.
Thank you.